My name is Stefan Samoji. I'm on the Fusion team at VMware. And we're here this morning to talk to you about putting Fusion to work. And we're going to focus on enterprise-oriented things that we're aware of, that people occasionally stumble upon when they're trying to do large-scale deployments. We're taking a slightly different tack and focusing on some of the business aspects and the business realities and the operational realities of trying to use Fusion on a larger scale. I'm compelled to show you this disclaimer slide. I've shown it to you. And now a word from our sponsors. If you've gone to a number of other sessions about some of our sort of endpoint solutions, you will have seen these slides 1,000 million times already here at VMware. So I'm not going to go through them in great detail. The really crucially important part of this overarching message is when we talk about the consumer cloud experience for the enterprise. If you think about Fusion, Fusion is, in many ways, a focused consumer product. And we lavish a great deal of attention and detail on making the user experience for a Fusion user extremely good and extremely Mac-like. And what we're seeing right now is this high watermark, this desire to have consumer-grade user experience is actually trickling into the enterprise. So we feel really good because that's been our approach from day one with Fusion, and now we're seeing that the enterprise users are demanding that level of fit and finish. Before I get into the meat of the slides, I'd actually like to ask you guys a bunch of questions. How many of you came in here not really familiar with Fusion, wanting to get an overview of it? Okay. How many of you are here specifically to learn about Fusion in enterprise? Okay. How many of you are here to learn interesting stuff that might not be in the documentation that might help you in your job? Good. Hands came up faster that time. How many of you use Fusion individually? You personally use Fusion today. How many of you have deployed Fusion in an enterprise environment? Okay, interesting balance. How many of you would consider yourselves educational users? EDU, higher ed, K-12? How many enterprise? Okay. Do any of you work in Mac-dominant environments where the largest proportion of users in your organization is Macs? Okay. How many of you Windows-dominant? Anybody Linux-dominant? Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, I knew about you. Thank you. That's very helpful because it lets me calibrate what I'm going to talk about and lets us as a team also calibrate the interest level. So I'm going to briefly walk through how Fusion works specifically in a Mac OS X context, how we got to where we are today, which is Fusion 3.1, the very perceptible growing Mac general use in enterprise and Fusion in particular, some of the use cases we know of. We have a bunch of useful things we think you probably want to know, and then we'll go to questions at the very end. So overarchingly, this is a standard VMware architecture slide. VMware Fusion is an app. It runs on Mac OS X. Stuff that goes on inside the VM happens in a standard VMware virtualized environment. So for those of you who have long familiarity with VMware products, how things behave inside a guest environment, we are maintaining all of that. We took the mature and reliable VMware technology and we put it on the Mac, and we added Mac-grade fit and finish, Mac-grade user experience, and made it all work together. But every VM has its own CPU, its own memory, all of the standard things you would expect from a VM. One of the questions that we get is, how do you distinguish Fusion from other desktop products? And so if you look at the overlapping part of this not quite Venn diagram, Fusion is obviously built for the Mac, and I can't overstate that enough. We spend a lot of time making sure that our user experience is as Mac-like as we can possibly make it. It is consumer-grade user experience. We do not use consumer-grade as an epithet. For us, that is absolutely a high standard that we continually strive to attain. We've got bootcamp integration. We don't have some of the advanced configuration features that those of you who are familiar with Workstation on either Linux or Windows are familiar with, but that's because that's not the kind of product that Fusion is. And so we're going to focus on making sure that the user experience for the end user is the best possible one in a Mac environment. I think one indicator of this is the Unity feature that you guys are probably familiar with. That's something that was Fusion first, and then it made its way over to Workstation because we want to make sure that it reaches the initial audience of the Mac audience that cares about these sorts of things first and foremost. And once we had it done that way, we were able to migrate it over. We support Expose. We take advantage of spaces, and I'll be showing you some of that lately. A lot of this Mac fit and finish stuff is incredibly time-consuming, but it's also very worthwhile. In terms of the timeline, since VMworld last year, we released Fusion 3.0 last October with over 50 new features. We have the Windows Migration Assistant for those folks who are switching from Windows to Mac. Makes it a lot easier, makes it as seamless as we possibly can make it. To those of you who are old hands, yeah, sure, it's P2V conceptually, but at the same time, making P2V easy to use is a considerable challenge, and we think we pulled it off. We're optimized for Snow Leopard. We have a fully 64-bit native engine. We had, in 3.0, quite good video and 3D performance, and we were optimized for Windows 7 on day one. And that actually has turned out to have had substantial payoff. We did 2 bug fix releases. Last May, we released Fusion 3.1, and one of our core focuses for that release was performance. We knew that we'd gotten the reliability and the stability right in 3.0, but we also found areas where we thought that we could make things faster, and sure enough, we could. So Fusion 3.1 is, without question, the fastest release we've done, including much faster 3D performance and video performance. Everything that we could tune, that we could find, got tuned. We also added some ease-of-use features because speed isn't always just about raw benchmark scores. Sometimes it's also about improving usability. So we added a feature called Easy Connect, which for USB, if you plug a USB device into your Mac, it will pop up and ask you, do you want this to go straight to the VM, or do you want this to go to the Mac, and do you want us to remember that for that device? And that turns out to be a very useful thing because once you've done it, once you've explained to Fusion that this is what you want, it's just going to keep doing that. Additionally, we continue to support over 150 guest OSs, including Windows 7 64-bit, Snow Leopard Server, Ubuntu 10.04 LTS, all of these different guest OSs because we find that a lot of our users use a wide variety of guest OSs, even though we do have some majority cases that we'll talk about a little later. We've got very good OpenGL support because it turns out that we have a bunch of users who use CAD, who use apps like Worldwide Telescope from Harvard, who really care about correctness and the ability to display stuff in 3D apps and have it work well. We also feel that for our switchers, this is perhaps less focused on the enterprise, but for our switchers, it's really important that we also give them AV because running in a Windows environment without AV seems a bit foolish. We feel it's a good thing for us to be doing to help them along on that path. So in terms of the Migration Assistant, this is about as easy as we can possibly make it. It uses Bonjour, which is an Apple-originated technology, but it's available cross-platform. You can set up with a very few number of key presses and mouse clicks the ability to P2V from a Windows machine to your Mac. If you're running it over Gigabit Ethernet, it is wicked fast. It goes very quickly, and it's about as easy as we can possibly make it. Unity is the classic example of integrating Windows and Mac user experiences, but without making Windows too Mac-like, because that turns out to lead to user confusion. You don't want to make Windows look like Mac Windows because Windows and Windows apps behave differently. So you want to maintain some of the visual cues there so that the users know what they're doing, which way they're going. With Fusion 3.1, we introduced a feature that we call the User Experience Improvement Program. And what it does is anonymously send us information about your guest environment, about your host environment, and what it lets us do is make data-driven decisions for future product directions. It tells us what you guys are using out in the world. It tells us a lot of stuff about what's actually going on. We can make some educated guesses about what's out there. We also have some heartfelt desires. And one of them was a decreasing XP population. It turns out, we're not that lucky at this point. If you look at this graph, this is what our Fusion users are using today out there in the world. About a little over a third of them are still on XP, continue to run it. Windows 7 has increased drastically and is continuing to trend up. We were also surprised to see, in terms of the Linuxes out there, there's a clearly dominant guest OS in terms of Ubuntu, and it's statistically very, very noticeable. So what this allows us to do when we're doing product planning is figure out which guest OSs we need to support, which guest OSs it's worth investing more R&D into to see where can we improve the user experience, where can we improve the product overall. And so for those of you who are sitting on the fence about whether or not to permit Fusion to give us that information back, like I said, it's anonymous. We're also very intent on the fact that it's opt-in. It is not on by default. You have to opt into this. But we use this information to make useful decisions, to make the product better for you. So the more that we know about your environment, the better decisions that we can make. One of the other favorite sets of stats that we got out of all this is, what hardware do people run Fusion on? And it's abundantly clear. Not only do half of our users roughly run on MacBook Pros, but 2/3 run on portable devices, on MacBooks and MacBook Pros together. The second largest contingent of users is the iMac users, and we have an entirely reasonable grouping. Other is basically Mac Pros and Minis. But what was very interesting to us is that this tells us clearly that we need to think about battery life. We need to think about performance in a situation where you have to make trade-offs between, do you chew up the battery, give better performance to the guest? What's the right thing to do? So this gives us the opportunity to make start these contemplations and start working out how all this stuff works. Very conveniently, about a week and a half ago, the folks at Valve Software, makers of Steam, released some hardware stats about their user population. And what was interesting are both the similarities and the differences. It's very clear that we actually, on the Fusion base, use, by and large, beefier machines than the Steam folks. But on the other hand, this tells us a lot about, for example, the GPUs that are out there. So if we're looking for interesting ways to improve graphics performance for Fusion users, we can now see from two totally separate user bases, because we don't know exactly how much overlap there is between the two, but from two separate user bases, we have a very good idea of the population of GPUs out there in the world. What tweaks, what tunings can we do in order to make all this stuff work better, work faster for you? So who do we know who uses Fusion today? It's obviously the switchers. So these tend to be individual users. Certainly those of you who have any kind of IT function are not only supporting your customers at work, but you're probably also supporting friends and family. So sooner or later, you're probably going to be supporting somebody who's doing the switching. So being aware of some of their special needs, and at the same time knowing that we expend a lot of effort to get this switch process working as seamlessly as possible, that's very helpful. We know there are a lot of web developers out there who are using Fusion because they need to do some testing, they need to do cross-platform work. The classic software developer is also a Fusion user. Academia, enterprise. When we talk to our customers across all of these groups, we actually find that all the users want reliability. They want something that once it's up and running, it stays up and running, it doesn't misbehave, it doesn't crash, it just works. They want fit and finish, they do care about this, and they want performance. So when we talk to the web developers, it's very clear that the cool kids today, they're using Macs for web dev. Even though they might not be deploying on Macs, this is what they're using to do the development. They want to be able to test on multiple OSs. They want to be able to test across multiple browsers, across multiple OSs. In some cases, they want to use simulators on multiple OSs and browsers and simulators across multiple OSs. And so you suddenly have this huge matrix of testing opportunities, which now, because they have Fusion, they can actually do this on their machine. They can do this on a MacBook Pro in a cafe, doing lots of networking on that machine. This was not possible prior to Fusion and prior to this environment. So the Fusion really gives this type of user the independence to use their platform, to use the tools that they need, to switch back and forth, and to be as seamless about this as possible. When it comes to classic developers, in many ways, they have exactly the same issues. Development tools can be very platform-centric. This is particularly the case in embedded development. There's a company called Pacific Tech out there. They develop a very nice piece of software called the Graphene Calculator. And they're a Mac-based shop, but they have a Windows version. And it's not because they're using some compatibility library, but in fact, they do all their Windows development in Fusion. So this is a classic example of an existing software developer using Fusion as their only Windows-based platform before getting the product out there. And this is a product that's generally quite popular, both in K-12, mainly high schools, and some higher ed. So we get very good feedback from developers that this is something that they desire, that they use, and that works really well for them. Academia tends to encompass the web developers, the classic developers, but also typical enterprise users. So it's actually fairly rare that we find something in the academic environment that we haven't encountered somewhere else before. But what's interesting about that environment is it's everything in one. So that sort of thing keeps us on our toes. When we contemplate the enterprise, though, about 2 weeks ago, there was a story based on data from Needham and from IDC about Mac sales growth year over year, so June 2009 to June 2010, in education, government, home, and business. What was startling about the statistic was that Mac shipments into government grew by 200%, and is 16 times faster than the market average of 12.1%. So, this caught a lot of people by surprise. We actually weren't that surprised because we've been seeing this kind of trending over time. The number was surprisingly large, certainly, but in terms of trends, this is stuff that we've been seeing. The other thing that's interesting is the Mac's growth in business was 3 times higher than the market average. Again, we're seeing more and more Macs move into the enterprise, and experientially, the way the Mac introduction to the enterprise is looking right now is very similar to when RIM first entered the market, because BlackBerry devices initially had a price premium. There was a certain amount of back-end support that they needed, but the XX were the ones demanding it. And so BlackBerries got pushed top down, and we're seeing something very, very similar happen with Macs. This is one of my favorite executive quotes from the COO of VMware. He was giving an interview, and this sort of exemplifies this phenomenon where it's the CIOs who get the Macs first. It's the CEOs. It's the C-level people who are getting the Macs first, and it's then trickling down into the organization. And, I love the soundbite. I love the fact that our sales guys actually use Fusion CIO bait, but this has been going on for some time. It's really nice to see this become that visible. So when we look at the enterprise customer, there's both the hypothetical one that we sort of envision, but there's also the folks that we go out and talk to. It turns out that, without exception, the enterprise users want all the things that the consumers want. But they want manageability, they want scalability, they want compliance support in any kind of regulated environment. And there's a growing movement to BYOPC, to bring your own PC to work. Increasing numbers of companies are doing this. But what we're finding is BYOPC really means bring your own Mac, because every customer that we've talked to that has a BYOPC program actually then encounters this huge demand for support of Macs in their enterprise environment. One large healthcare provider that I spent some time talking to a couple of months ago, the literal quote was, "We can't stave these Mac users off any longer." So they had been resisting as hard as they could because they didn't want to support multiple platforms, and they hadn't really sat down and figured out how much additional support really was required. And so they were at a point right now where they felt they couldn't actually stop doing this. So everything that we're seeing right now is it continues to grow. The sales numbers support this. Since you're here, you guys are evidence proof that this is happening. And so to that end, I'm going to switch over. Hopefully we have made the appropriate sacrifices to the demo gods to make this demo work. But there's a bunch of stuff that we'd like to show you that isn't necessarily the most first and foremost things that you see when you're using Fusion, but we find them very useful in our day-to-day use, and we hope that you will also find them interesting. So, if this works, it does. So, I've actually been running this whole thing in Fusion, in Windows 7, using PowerPoint 2010. I've not actually been using the standard PC here because we believe also very strongly in using our own product. One of the first things that we'd like to show you is what we call Unity mode. And in Unity, Windows are Mac windows. You can move them around. You can do all sorts of stuff with them that you can. And so for somebody who is switching or who may be a Mac user who's starting to explore the necessity for certain types of Windows apps, being able to just treat these things as any old window within their environment is hugely beneficial. As part of Unity, we have what we call internally Dockers. Every Windows app that you run has a representative, a graphically visible and identifiable representative in the dock. But what we can do is I can take a PowerPoint file that's on my Mac desktop, and I can drag it onto PowerPoint, which is Windows PowerPoint, and run it, and it just opens there. So this is what we mean when we talk about seamlessness. You don't have to know all the stuff that we're doing behind the scenes. It just works. The other nice thing is, if you want to use Expose, since these are separate windows, you can switch between the windows, you can go back in Expose, pick up another window. All of the integration into the user experience improvements that the OS has provided over the years and that Apple continues to do, we support them directly. And it's a lot of work to make this stuff work cleanly and properly throughout. One other particularly fun thing is if you're using full screen, we also support spaces. And for those of you who use spaces, so you can take your Windows environment, move it back and forth, when this gets really interesting is if you use the keyboard shortcut, you can just switch very cleanly between your Mac environment. Everything looks like a Mac, everything's great. But if you have a need for a full screen Windows app, here you go. Again, fully seamless, doesn't get in the way of anybody. But since you're on a Mac, we want to also give you the opportunity, if you're in full screen mode, to do Mac-like reasonable things. And in this particular instance, we can minimize that. We can bring up the library window. It feels right. We've done user testing. We've spent some time figuring out what feels right to users. We've also got a couple of subtle little features. I don't know how many of you knew that if you just grab the image of the running VM from within the library window and drag it out onto the desktop, you wind up with a screenshot. So any of you doing documentation, courseware, or if you have folks who you're providing support for, this is a hugely useful feature. Another thing that you can do with drag and drop is if you actually take the VM itself and drag it out onto the desktop, you wind up getting an alias to the VM. So it's a really quick way to launch the VM if you want to keep it on your desktop. And again, it's a fit and finish issue. We want to make sure that this is as easy and as intuitive to use as possible. How many of you out there know that there's a VNC server built into Fusion? Okay. So, this is actually worth mentioning. One of the bits of feedback that we got over the years is it was too hard when Fusion booted to get into the BIOS to switch your boot device. And so we decided, let's put a UI on this so that you don't have to play the timing games with, did you hit the function key at the right time? So we added this, and this has been very well received. So yes, we actually have a VNC server built into Fusion that you can connect to from any old VNC client. So I'm going to go and use the Mac's own screen sharing, which is a standard VNC client. It's worth noting Apple has some proprietary extensions to their VNC protocol that adds encrypting keystrokes. So if you're in a Mac dominant environment, or if you have a lot of Macs that you're VNC into, your keystrokes will get encrypted. Our backend doesn't support this. It's something that's worth mentioning. But as you can see, this is a VNC window. I can move stuff around. I can actually drive it. This isn't a dead screenshot, and it just works. So in addition to VNC, there's a bunch of other things that you can do. If you hold down the Option key after you've right-clicked on the VM, you get the option to open the configuration file in the editor. This is not necessarily something that the typical user wants to be able to do, but an IT admin, absolutely, because it turns out that this is the VMX file that those of you who are familiar with VMXs, this is the VMX file for this VM. It's an easy way to get there if you want to change configurations. The lines that I've selected here right now are the ones for VNC. These are the standard things that all VMware VMs support. You can even see the boot order as defined in that advanced UI. So we do wonder what is worth exposing to the user, what isn't. But for those of you who have either the experience or the desire, you can actually dig into this stuff and use it, and it works exactly as you would expect it to. Another worthwhile thing to do is, so this open an editor feature, by default, it's going to use the system default text editor, which generally speaking is text edit. For my part, I don't prefer text edit as an applications environment, so I've set it to BB edit. You can switch it to whatever editor that you want. Another enterprise-specific feature that we know is in use out there, but we also suspect is not terribly well known, is the ability to tell Fusion not to check for updates from VMware's update server, but in fact, if you want to host your own updates, because you might want to control how you roll out new versions of Fusion within your enterprise, there are all sorts of reasons why you might want to do this. Well, we have the ability to do this. This is also the kind of information that's in our enterprise deployment guide. We're actually actively revising it right now. And at the end of my talk, I'll give you an idea of how to get a hold of it. It's not quite done yet, but we have a very straightforward way of informing you when it will become available. So one other thing that we think is pretty cool about BBEdit is it lets you select a bunch of different web browsers to do HTML previews, because we know that a lot of web developers use BBEdit to hack the HTML directly. You know, with Chrome, I've got Chrome inside my VM, and I've also got Chrome native. The rendering differences between platforms are negligible. You know, maybe a pixel here, a pixel there, but it's nothing serious. What you can't do natively on the Mac is preview your web pages in IE. So we thought it might be interesting if we took some HTML and previewed it in IE. And this is going to be the true test of whether the demo gods like me today or not. Oh, the demo gods are into liking me. Now they like me. So what I just did was I had an HTML file open in BBEdit in the Mac environment, and I told it, give me a preview of that, and it opened it up in IE over here. So I can, just to prove to you that this is live, I'm going to say run Windows on your Mac, now even more faster than ever. You know, grammar is not as important as the ability to run a good demo, and now it's even more faster than ever. So this is the kind of feature also that we enable for third parties to take full advantage of. It's not just something built into Fusion, but we also have ISVs that take full advantage of that. So one final thing for the extra geeky among you. How many of you are familiar with VM Run from other VMware products? How many of you know that VM Run is actually available under Fusion? Okay, so turns out we actually do provide VM Run. So what VM Run does, it's a command line tool to do things with VMs. And the reason this is really useful is you can start scripting stuff. And you can perform automated actions. You can start a VM, stop a VM, reset it. You can do things with snapshots. You can create snapshots, delete them. You can run specific programs and guests. I was building a script about a month ago to invoke the Windows defragment tool from the Mac because I had an automated process I wanted to set up. So there's an awful lot of really cool stuff that you can take advantage of if you know about it from the other VMware products. We bring that to you, and the reason that we can bring that to you is that the core technology is the same. You know, so all of these tools are in Library, App Support, VMware Fusion, and if you actually look at it, so here's VM Run. I've actually, because I use these tools so often, I've just changed my standard path to go here. Other tools worth knowing about: VMware vDisk Manager. Those of you who knew about VM Run probably know about this. I would urge great caution, though. These are power user tools. You can do bad things to your data if you are not wary. So I wouldn't recommend going and telling all your users about all these cool tools, because sooner or later somebody's going to shoot themselves in the foot. But in terms of providing IT support and enterprise support, these tools actually turn out to be very, very useful. So with that, let's... curses. Much better. So VMware Fusion, if the three big takeaways that we're hoping that you'll take away from this, it's built for the Mac. A lot of attention has been paid on making it Mac-like, but it's also proven VMware technologies, very mature technologies. It's consumer grade, user experience, but enterprise grade underneath. And with that, I'd like to start the Q&A going. If you haven't already, please fill out the survey. For those of you interested in the Enterprise Deployment Guide and in continuing a conversation about enterprise stuff, we have a VMware-hosted list called Fusion Enterprise. This is how you join it. You either send an email message to that email address, or you go to that webpage and sign up. This is where we're going to announce the availability of the Enterprise Deployment Guide when it becomes available. We're thinking right now about whether or not we want to do a pre-release and send a draft out there and get some comments back and maybe get some ideas of things that you out there in the world have encountered. But either way, this is a good list to be on if you want to use Fusion in the enterprise. And hopefully you're going to have questions, because I've left time for questions. If you'd be so kind to go to the microphone, we would all appreciate it very much.
One of the things we'd like to do is, for instance, in an enterprise environment, when we release, say, virtual appliances, say through the marketplace and things like that, people try those on ESX and things like that. Can we try an evaluation version of that, for people to try it on their laptops, on, say, Fusion?
Generally speaking, the virtual appliances do work. So if you go into the home screen, actually I want to leave that up there. If you go into the home screen, there is an option for go to the virtual appliance corpus that we host at VMware. So that should work.
And this includes the new, the OVF formats and things like that, things packaged up as OVAs that typically you can download. Okay.
So the OVF tool was bundled with Fusion 3.1.
So I know the OVF tool is, but can people just fire up Fusion and just basically say import?
They have to use the OVF tool command line. It's bundled with Fusion.
So it's only through the OVF tool?
Only the OVF tool.
Yeah, so you have to turn the OVA into the discrete files and then make that work. Anybody else? You guys are so quiet.
There's no phone support.
Do you have any intention to add support for connecting to remote VMs from VMware Fusion? It sounds like you can with Workstation.
So why do you want that specifically? I mean, sort of in the abstract, I understand it, but why is that something that you would want in Fusion in particular?
Because it's a development environment, right? Developers have their own Macs, and we run simulations in the lab on VMware.
Okay, so you have developers who are using Fusion, and they want to talk to a VM on ESX, or...
Right.
Okay, duly noted. It's not the first time we've heard that, but it's always important for us to know why people want to do this sort of thing. Pat, do you want to talk about the...
So what do you want out of a phone client that's useful? Telephone support?
Yeah, if I have an emergency, there's no phone support.
There's phone support. It's an option you provide you guys in the office.
So the question was, why don't we have phone support? And we do indeed have phone support. You can get it as part of your, like a VMware support contract.
If you buy SMS phone support. So you buy SMS.
So, please.
So I know it's not really a Fusion issue, but switching between Windows and Mac as far as moving the VMDKs back and forth. So as VMs are 40, 60, 80 gig, it makes it a challenge going between NTFS and the Mac operating system file system as far as the file size limits on Windows. Does VMware have anything to do to make that easier?
I honestly am not entirely sure what the problem is. So NTFS can handle the large file sizes. A Fusion
So
created...
like taking the VM and moving between the Mac laptop and a Windows laptop consistently. You know, actually using two different laptops based on the needs and moving the VMDKs over.
Run it off an external drive, you can just keep the same VM, the same drive back and forth.
So are you bummed about how long it takes to do it?
Not really. I just, there's some issues with it.
Like what? Because we do that sort of
File size
thing.
limits.
So
So-
that 32 has file size limits.
Right.
Fusion can work with this by splitting files into 2 gigabyte chunks, so it's an option on the disks. But NTFS and HFS collections have file size limits there.
Yeah. So if it's a FAT32...
FAT32, it's under virtual machine settings, disks, split into 2 gigabyte chunks.
And is there any...
That's on my default.
Similar
It
on
is.
that, is there any plans to, so when I flip back to VMware Workstation, I got to update the tools again, right? From Fusion to Workstation, the tools are different in the guest OS.
While we encourage you to run the same version of tools, and you know, that shift with the product that you're using, Workstation and Fusion should be close enough that especially if you're running like Workstation 7.1 and Fusion 3.1, it should be an issue.
Yeah, the tools versions are in very close parity, so that really shouldn't bite you. By default, as Eric said, by default, when Fusion creates a VM, the VMDK is a multi-extent with 2 gigabyte chunks, and one of the reasons for that decision was specifically because of the FAT32 issue. But if you're moving stuff back and forth, you should probably be using NTFS or HFS Plus anyway, and both of those file systems don't have that hard and fast limit.
Okay.
One thing you might be confused about is that Fusion virtual machines appear as a bundle, but they're really a folder with split chunks. So even though it's like 40, 60 gigabytes, it's actually like composed smaller.
That's actually a good point. So if in the Finder you right-click on the VMDK and open it up, you will actually see that it is a bundle. It is, and with a bunch of individual 2 gigabyte files. And Workstation can definitely open those and use those, and there's no problem there. Please.
Yes, you had indicated earlier in a slide how many people were using the MacBook Pro and other Mac devices. Do you have any information on the amount of RAM that people are running on their MacBook Pro when
Yes.
they're using Fusion?
The vast majority of the hardware out there has 4 gigs.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it kind of depends, though. So, for instance, one of the things that we find in support, one of the number one issues when people call up and say, oh, my VM is really, really slow, lots of folks over-provision and over-resource their VMs. So they crank, they take Windows 7, they say they give it 1.5 gigs, they give it 2 gigs of RAM because, more is better. Turns out it isn't. So even though it turns out it's really, really hard to make any kind of general case pronouncement for what's the right amount of RAM for a given guest OS. The VM that I use day in, day out is a Windows 7 64-bit Ultimate VM. I've got Office in there. I've given it 890-some megs of RAM, and I've never needed any more. What that does, if you actually make the effort to reduce the RAM size, it makes your suspend and resume faster. Because every time you suspend, you are writing out the totality of the RAM of the VM. The only downside is it takes some fiddling, because understanding exactly what your workload is, what apps you run inside that VM on an ongoing basis, how many of those apps run simultaneously, that's not something that you can really develop good heuristics for. And any heuristic that you develop would guess wrong and cause other crankiness. But if that's the kind of thing that you worry about and you care about, and if you have users who complain about things like suspend resume performance, figure out how little RAM you can give them. Same thing we find that there are people out there who say, I've got a Mac Pro with lots of cores. Let's give the VM extra cores. Unless you have a guest app that absolutely positively needs to see multiple cores, just give it 1 core. You will be happy that you did it.
So just as a follow-on to that, is there any plans to do any memory ballooning
In
Fusion?
The balloon actually works.
Okay.
It works, but it doesn't. There's not a lot of value in the curve of one VM setup.
Okay.
It's just not used. And on a one VM setup on
what if in a test dev environment where you have multiple Fusion VMs that you'd want to be testing on?
I forget exactly how the balloon works. I mean, the balloon it provides some value. We do actually optimize our memories already in Fusion, but we grab memory that's actually mapped up front. So there's some memory optimizations already.
Okay. And you had indicated earlier integration with Boot Camp. Maybe if you could expand on that a little bit more.
So you can launch Boot Camp as a VM in Fusion. So if you have a Boot Camp partition and you have Fusion running, you can use Boot Camp either by rebooting into it, but what we're finding is very, very useful is if you already have the Boot Camp partition, you already have something installed, you can launch it as a Fusion VM.
I actually use that now. But I'm really not a fan of Boot Camp. I can't stand it. Windows 7 runs horribly on Boot Camp. It burns my Mac up. What I wondered is, I use Steam, and I have to use Boot Camp. Is there at any point where VMware will be at the point to where it can run it just as good as Boot Camp, or?
So I am one of those people who also uses Steam inside the VM because I want to know what it feels like. Alien Swarm actually plays surprisingly well.
Okay.
That said, there is always going to be a gap between raw hardware and virtualized hardware. And that's sort of a laws of physics thing. You know, as you can see from the jump that we made from Fusion 3.0 to Fusion 3.1, when Apple released their Snow Leopard graphics update, we actually benefited from that as well. So particularly if you look at the stats that Valve has put out in terms of the performance delta of the same app running on the Mac versus running on Windows, there's still a substantial gap for Apple to actually match. So everything that everybody else does to improve graphics performance will benefit us. We ourselves are continually working on making it faster. Should you expect to ever run a day one high-end PC game inside a VM and get equivalent frame rates? Not even I'm that optimistic.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd love to, but it's really hard.
And I know they've created Steam for Mac now.
Yes.
So it's kind of like you can just eliminate that altogether. So
Sure, and there's a lot of games that they have on Steam that are available on both platforms, and they've actually been really cool about it that if you buy one game that is available on both platforms, you can actually play it on either platform. Not simultaneously, but they've been really nice about that. So, for Portal, for all their Valve games that they've done it, but there's also third-party games on Steam that permit that. If it's available on the Mac, you'll get better performance playing it natively under OS X, no question.
I know before that if you configured Fusion with your OS to use one single file, that Time Machine had issues backing up that large file. Is that still an issue?
Well, Time Machine has issues for certain definitions of issues with really, really large files because anytime that file changes, it wants to back up the whole file. So using Time Machine in that particular situation may not be the ideal choice. Certainly what we do, you benefit to a certain extent by the fact that Fusion VMs by default use these 2 gigabyte chunks, but every time one of those changes, you are going to back up that 2 gigabyte file every time.
Okay, so it's definitely recommended not to use a single file then, correct?
There are probably legitimate reasons to do it, but we pick that default for a very good reason. There are many reasons to use the non-single file, to use the multi-extent version.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we can absolutely rat hole down that one. There's a lot of different implications that you need to take into account. Going once. Feature requests. Anybody? I would have thought that those would have come up by now. Unity in spaces.
Using Unity to be able to grab the Windows dragon space.
Okay. Duly noted. Not the first time we've heard that one. Going once. Going twice. Thank you very much.